Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for Alumni University tonight. I'm Kristen, the Director of Constituent Engagement here at Illinois Tech. We are so happy to have Carly Kocurek joining us this evening. So before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping notes for everyone on the call. All of the attendees' video and audio is currently muted. So if you have a question throughout the presentation, please go ahead and type it in that chat box and we'll make sure that it's answered at the end of the presentation. Additionally, this presentation is being recorded, including the chat box, and the recording will be available on our website in the next several weeks. So to introduce our presenter, Carly Kocurek, Ph.D., is a cultural historian specializing in the study of new media technologies and video gaming. She's the author of 2 books, Coin-Operated Americans, Rebooting Boyhood at the Video Game Arcade, and Brenda Laurel, Pioneering Games for Girls. Her articles have appeared in numerous scholarly journals, including Game Studies, the Journal of Gaming and Virtual Worlds, Technical Communication Quarterly, and Visual Studies, among others. She's also the co-founder and co-edits the Game Designers book series for Bloomsbury. Here at Illinois Tech, she teaches courses on digital culture, interactive storytelling, game design, and media history to both undergraduate and graduates. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Kocurek to get started.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm going to share screen, so just give me a second. Because as we have all learned in the past year and a half, nothing actually works like it's supposed to. So what I want to talk about today is actually dolls. I am very interested in how video games become kind of part of popular culture more broadly. And one of the places that I have been fascinated to see that happening is in the American Girl doll brand. So I'm going to start with a little bit about me and about my research, and then I'll talk through this kind of current project, and then we can chat about any questions you have. And starting here, this is kind of like a little virtual version of my office I made to use while I was teaching online. So I thought I would share it with you because I think it's fun, and some of my students also thought it was fun. So I'm Associate Professor of Digital Humanities and Media Studies. My PhD is in American Studies, which is a cultural history field, interested in kind of how cultural practices are formed, how we make meaning through popular culture, and things like that. I've been at Illinois Tech since 2012. And outside of work, I was told to say some fun things about myself. I don't know how fun these are for anyone that's not me, but I find them fun. I'm very interested in quilting and sewing. I make art quilts and functional quilts, and I also increasingly sew most of my own clothes. I'm a reader. I mostly read science fiction and fantasy, and I also really love theme parks. So when I take students on study abroad, I usually try and make them go to theme parks with me. They don't always go, but it's fun. And so that's just a little bit about me kind of as a person and as a professional. My 2 books, which were mentioned in the introduction, these are the covers. I like to show them because I like the covers. But also they're available broadly. So if you want to buy a copy, you can get them anywhere that you like to purchase books. And you can also actually get them through your local library. They are in the public library system. And so if your library doesn't have it, you can get it through interlibrary loan usually. So I always appreciate when people read my books or buy my books or send my books to their friends. So if you're so inclined, please do. I also do a lot of things kind of outside of conventional boundaries of scholarship. Some of this is because of the area I work in. I am actually a practicing game designer. So in addition to researching games, I do make games, and that informs how I teach students to make games. And some of it's because I really strongly feel that the kind of work I do is relevant to the games industry. It's relevant to people that play games, and it's relevant to people that have family members that play games. So I really try and make sure I'm making my work available in multiple forms. This is just a few examples of things I've done. At the bottom right, that's my zine. It's called Save Point. It's a zine about video game history. I funded the print runs of the first 2 issues, both on Kickstarter. You can actually download the first issue for free on my itch page, which is a site that is used to distribute games and zines and things like that. The second issue should be up there shortly, actually. Top right is actually a very weird thing that it always confuses people. This appears to be an academic journal article. It's in a real journal. It's called Ada New Media. And this is an article I wrote to be part of a game. And so this is actually an article by a person that doesn't exist, that's written as if it's the future. And so if you actually spend time like clicking on the links and trying to figure out what's going on with this article, it's actually an alternate reality game. And it leads you through a number of things, including like, you know, different media artifacts and different kinds of stories. And it really tells this kind of apocalyptic fiction story that's a meditation on how we use code and everyday life, right? So steganography is the act of hiding things in plain sight. Famously, during World War II, and this example is in the article, women living along the coast of Britain would actually knit or crochet to encode observations of naval movement off the coast, for example. And then bottom left is actually an article I wrote for Vice magazine for their Waypoint section, which is about video games. And that's actually what I'm talking about today, is this like how an American Girl mall rat reimagines gaming's past. Because when this doll was released, everyone sent it to me and I was like, yes, that's very weird. And so I actually got to talk to American Girl's historian and the woman that wrote the first book about that character. And wrote this piece, but I've also continued to work on that. So this is Courtney. This is the doll. Courtney is a doll. If you are my age or slightly younger, you probably also recognize these things that Courtney is photographed with. Courtney is a doll produced by the American Girl doll brand, which is a subsidiary of Mattel at this point. They have a giant, beautiful store downtown. And the smaller doll that is the doll's doll, which is pretty meta, is named Molly. Molly was one of the original characters from Pleasant Company, and that's kind of the where American Girl starts. And so you can see there's Courtney, her Molly doll, the catalog for Pleasant Company, which I find hilarious, and then which also has Molly on the cover of the catalog, and then this book, tiny little book that the doll can read about her doll, right? So this is Courtney, she's a doll, and all of American Girl dolls' historical characters are really detailed. So they have all kinds of things that are very specific to the time period they're from. You can probably start thinking about what time period this particular doll is from. So Courtney's story is set in 1986. And she's part of a blended family. She lives with her mother, her stepsister, and her stepfather. Her dad is moving away. So kind of like the meta story here is that her dad's moving away. She has feelings about it. She doesn't always get along with her stepsister. Her mom's running for office, and that's putting stress on the family. She really loves to play video games. And so at school, when they have this like project where they're supposed to dream big about what they would do, she dreams up that she would make a video game. And so she starts trying to plot out this video game. And the story is that she just can't finish it. She can't figure out how to end it. And she realizes she could just tell a different kind of story than most of the games she's played. This is, I think, actually really interesting. And this has been kind of a major push in the games industry to make a more diverse type of games. My current research project, funded by the National Science Foundation, is in fact looking at the history of games for girls, right? The movement in the 90s to make games for girls. And indeed, that idea of like shifting the kinds of stories games can tell was really fundamental to that effort. So here's Courtney with her Trapper Keeper and her cool tie at school. She again loves to play video games, and she spends lots of times at the mall, both because she likes to play games in the arcade there and because her stepfather like manages the mall bookstore. So she loves to play games, and she particularly loves to play Pac-Man. And you can actually buy, this is a American Girl branded, fully licensed Pac-Man machine. And it's produced by a company called Quarter Arcade, which is a very cute name. And they make quarter-sized arcade machine replicas. They're fully functional, and you can play the game on them. They're really cute. I actually own this one. It's it's fun. I love it. I got it as a gift. It was a nice gift. But it's actually really, really weird that she plays Pac-Man. And it's weird for like a lot of reasons. So one of the reasons is that Pac-Man by 1986 is actually kind of old. It's first released, I believe, in 1982. I might be blanking on that year, but anyway, it's several years old at that point. Ms. Pac-Man was much newer. So why not Ms. Pac-Man? And then also, wouldn't she be playing Nintendo by now? And there's actually a few interesting factors here. They could not get the licensing for Ms. Pac-Man because I just straight asked American Girl, was like, what's up with that? They could not get the licensing for Ms. Pac-Man. And so there's that. Also, Ms. Pac-Man kind of derails the story, right? Because part of Courtney's story is like she wants to make a game that's more about girls and about people like her. And if she's playing this Pac-Man, like that doesn't quite fit. So they're able to get the licensing for Pac-Man, so that's good. I also suspect they could not get the licensing for the NES. I didn't ask about that one, but I think that's pretty likely. They do mention Nintendo. Her friend has like a new Nintendo and they're very excited and she wants to go play. But she does not have Nintendo and she primarily plays at the arcade. Also, just for fun, I'd like to point out in the back the like knockoff Orange Julius is called Orange Juicy, which I find hilarious. And there she is in her amazing cardigan with mismatched buttons. So again, like they couldn't get the licensing from Ms. Pac-Man, and Nintendo is notoriously really tight on their licensing in certain ways. So there's some kinds of things they'll let people make and other kinds of things that they will not. Nintendo, in fact, distinguishes itself early in the industry because one of the things that really hurts Atari, for example, when Atari is really the dominant console maker, is that they didn't require any kind of like deal to make games for the Atari 2600. So a lot of games got made for the 2600 that are either like literally pornography or they're very poor quality. And people didn't necessarily know that Atari wasn't the maker of those games. And so it really damages Atari's market reputation. Nintendo handles this by like keeping a really, really tight grip on who's able to make things for Nintendo. And that's continued for a long time. It's started to change in the past 10 years. But for a good 20 years, like you didn't make things for Nintendo unless Nintendo wanted you to make things for Nintendo. And so they still kind of keep an eye on that. Additionally, it's worth thinking about like arcades are public spaces and they are much more gendered than like the home console is at the time. That of course changes as we get into the 90s, but I'm not going to get into that too much. So again, like there's this kind of practical factor here, which is they really want to talk about Courtney's perceived lack of representation, that she doesn't see herself in the arcade. So even though she's like the best Pac-Man player and she's all over the scoreboard, she feels left out, she feels isolated, or she feels unseen in this medium she really loves. And then there's also that they really want to sell to a specific audience based on nostalgia. And so that nostalgia is really for parents or aunts and uncles or whoever who might be purchasing these dolls to share something with their kid or their family members, right? So if you want to hit the nostalgia of that parent group, you probably want a game that's just old enough to have been part of their childhood, and Pac-Man might actually hit that a little better. And you can also see, I'll just mention, there's lots of branding that happens with these dolls. So here she has on like a lip smacker, and it's like an actual branded lip smacker. The Walkman is not branded Walkman, so that's not licensed, but you'll see this across their line, both for their historical characters and for their modern characters, that they'll really get into those specific brands, which is really interesting, and I think tells us some really interesting things about childhood and consumer habits and kind of authenticity that I think is very interesting and really important to think about, because increasingly the experience of childhood is a branded experience, right? So she's not the only doll in this brand with her own toys and games. These are the so Felicity on the left was introduced the last, but the other three here are the original three dolls, Molly, Samantha, and Kirsten. And you can see all of these dolls have their own toys. I focused here on their holiday collections or their winter collections. So you'll see here Kirsten has a little really lovely handmade doll, right? And the doll, it has hair styled like hers, which I think is very sweet. There are some other things that show up across her line, but there's the doll, which I think is recognizable, right? You also see, like, here's Samantha. She has like a little special book and a music box. She has a porcelain doll, which fits with the Victorian setting of her story. And then we have Molly, who gets into that kind of like World War II boom period. So her story is set during World War II. So she has all kinds of stuff, right? She has a paint set, she has a yo-yo, she has a flip book with Mickey Mouse in it. She has a snow globe, she has a radio, she has all these nice things in her stocking. She, you know, there's candy. She has a doll that's styled like a nurse, right? She's a Red Cross nurse. But even when you go back to Felicity, whose story is set really during the American Revolutionary period, she has like this jumping jack paper doll, and she has other toys as well, right? There's like a top, and her skates, which are used primarily as a toy or as a plaything in the context of the story. So what they're doing with Courtney is not necessarily new to the line, right? Like, this is something that this company has done for a long time, and they really focus on kind of the ephemera and the tactile experience of childhood alongside the kind of like wholesome stories of childhood. Something that's worth thinking about is this brand, when it's introduced, really focuses on this idea of these are like heirloom toys, right? They're quite expensive. They're still quite expensive, although I think the prices have not actually kept pace with inflation. So I think they're actually less costly now than when they originally came out, and that makes sense because they're now manufactured by a much larger organization. But there's a real focus on nostalgia, on authenticity. I believe almost all of these outfits you could actually buy like a girl version and a doll version, so you could dress to match your doll. And so sometimes you'll see on the catalog covers in particular, they'll show people dressed to match the doll, and it's like very, you know, classical childhood, right? We want like a classical childhood experience. That means playing with certain types of toys. It means sharing certain types of experiences. Baking comes up over and over again. In one version of the Felicity thing, you could actually buy like a cone of brown sugar, like a little tiny cone of brown sugar, because that was how sugar came in her period. And so there's a real interest in those kinds of authenticating details that are both historically very interesting for the periods they're talking about, but also historically very interesting for the periods in which they're made, right? Because when we make things set in the past, we're always actually showing the values of the present, right? So there's some different reasons that they do this, right? That we start getting these dolls that have toys, and also kind of like how those toys play out. This is another cover from the American Girl catalog. And here you can see some of those matching outfits. Here's Samantha, and here's Samantha's Christmas dress on the doll, on the human girl, and they're reading the Samantha story. And then here's Addie, and here's a girl in the Addie dress. Addie was introduced later. She's the first Black character in their historical characters line. And there's been a lot of great writing about what an interesting choice that is and how complicated it is, because that story is set in 1864, which if you're a historian, or if you're someone that thinks about history, of course, in 1865, we see the beginning of the American Civil War, right? Which is by and large a huge conversation and argument about slavery, right? And so Addie is a Black child in a country that is practicing slavery at that time. So really a deeply fraught character. And that isn't to say that none of the other dolls deal with serious issues, but like this one gets real heavy real fast, right? It's an interesting problem. They've since added additional dolls. So there's a doll that is part of the civil rights movement, for example, and is very interested in popular music and Motown, which is very interesting. So there's lots of different ways to kind of think about these. It's fascinating to me, though, that as they're introducing a Black doll, the person playing with the Black doll is a white child, right? So anyway, there's a few things here, right? Like, so one of them is that girls like dolls that are like them. Girls play with toys and have dolls. So the fact that the doll has a doll makes the doll more like them. often I think these choices are based at least partially on market research about what children are doing at the time. And it's a way to make that doll something that a child can engage with, relate to, right? So even though we're talking about 1778 or something, we're also talking about a time when, you know, girls got in arguments with their parents or went ice skating or played with their friends or had hopes and ambitions outside of what's allowed to them. And that's something I think girls really relate to. You can see this with young adult fiction as well, in middle grades fiction. So if you think about, there's a book called Catherine called Birdie that's like a major award winner, and it's about kind of the medieval period, and it's this girl who's the daughter of kind of a minor knight, right, a minor landowner, and she's supposed to marry, and of course like all the men, all her suitors are terrible, and so she kind of like carefully sabotages all these arrangements, but she can't sabotage all of them or she's actually doing something horrible to her whole family, right? And so it's about her trying to exercise choice in a system in which girls have very, very, very few choices. And so in some ways, like these dolls often are kind of conversations about like what kinds of choices are available to girls in a system and in a historical moment when girls aren't really valued. And I would argue girls are still often having to negotiate that kind of situation. So why do dolls have toys? Well, girls like dolls that are like them. If girls play games, the dolls should have games, right? Like Molly, you could get a checker set for, as an example here, right? And so there's often actually games the dolls can play too, even with the historical characters. Another thing is that this is fundamentally speculative fiction. Right. And so these are stories that aren't exactly how things were. These are stories in which girls are valued and they're taken seriously and they're treated like they matter. Right. And so in every one of these stories, the person at the center is like a 9 or 10-year-old girl. In Courtney's story, Courtney is the center of the story. And I think that's really profound, actually. A reason the story is set in 1986, I think I forgot to mention, and that this photo gives some, this is a promotional image, as most of these are, this photo gives some hint at, is that this was set in 1986 because this is when the Challenger disaster occurs. And the Challenger disaster is historically significant in its own right, of course. It's also hugely significant in the history of childhood and in the history of children's media. It was broadcast live. There were lots of efforts early on to engage children in this as public science. And of course, one of the people on that mission was a teacher who had applied and gone through a really rigorous process to be selected to be like the first teacher in space. And all over the US, there were efforts to have televisions brought into classrooms so that children could watch this across the country. This is this great moment of national pride, of enthusiasm about science and space exploration and about NASA. And it's tragic, right? And so this is also a moment of tremendous conversations about grief, about public grief, about childhood trauma, and about loss, right? And so it's really an interesting historical moment. So they really wanted to take it, continue that conversation about those things, especially I think right now we're having heavily mediated childhoods, and especially in the wake of the pandemic, this story feels very timely. And so that's why the story is set in 1986, which again is a little late for arcades, which is interesting, right? Like the major economic crash for video game arcades occurs in 1982. They'd had an earlier crash in like 1977, 78. And so by the mid 80s, arcades are kind of on the decline in some ways, even though they're still around. So again, like why would a girl play video games, or why would a doll play video games? It's because contemporary girls play video games, and it makes sense that they might be interested in a doll who also plays video games. And then also, if you think about the history of the arcade a lot, which I have, right? Like I wrote a book about it. I love arcades. If we're going to think about like, you know, inserting a girl back into that history, I think that's really actually pretty bold. It's a interesting maneuver, and many women, you know, in their late 30s or in their 40s or in their 50s, like grew up playing games either at home or at arcades or both, right? But often we're kind of seen as at the margins of that, even if it was one of their favorite things to do, right? So this is kind of like recentering that, where in fact she plays at the arcade. It's not a place she's you know, she has a fun time there. She meets her friends there. She's playing, and her sister's like her stepsister's trying to get her to leave the mall, and she's like, no, I'm still busy, right? Like, I'm gonna win. And so it's a really interesting kind of moment of forming her character and also her priorities, and thinking about you know, what childhood play looks like in the 1980s, but also what childhood play looks like today. So when dolls play, girls play. This is a different doll character whose story is set in the late 1970s, to kind of talk about Title IX, right? So this doll, her name's Julie. Julie plays basketball, but she also plays pinball. This is a working pinball machine that you can buy for your doll. But of course, a doll can't actually play pinball, so this is actually a working miniature pinball machine you can buy for your child. And this has been this toy has won tons of awards, right? Like, it's actually really successful both as a commercial product and as like a design product. And when I talked to girls actually about the new doll, the Courtney doll, and was like, oh, what do you think about this? And they were really excited. And when I asked them about Julie, none of the girls I talked to owned the pinball machine, but they were all really excited about it. Like, even the ones that owned the Julie doll were like, and I got to play the pinball machine at the store, and it's real. Right. And this idea of a real toy or real experience or like a real game was something that the girls were really into, right? Like this authenticity of that historical narrative, but also of the technology used, is really, really powerful. And pinball still is not like hugely accessible to girls or boys, right? Like, it's not super accessible to children. It's often in bars and things like that. And so it's fun to see this play technology be more broadly available. I'm sure the coin-op industry got very excited about this. And if you look, you can see the game is called The Flip Side. It's got all this kind of like fun 70s iconography. And if you look under that largest peace sign, under that hot pink peace sign, you can see it's, again, American Girl branded. Everything is American Girl branded. But again, this is like a promotional photo showing like what happens if you buy the pinball machine. And of course, your doll is there to look on lovingly, but your child will play, right? A girl will play. And that's actually what this is about. As a funny aside, my advisor from graduate school, her father very badly wanted her to be an electrical engineer. And so he bought 2 broken pinball machines, and they fixed them up together over the summer, like while she was in middle and high school. And she did not become an electrical engineer. She became a historian, but she apparently has fond memories of working on pinball machines with her father. So one of the things that I think is worth mentioning here, right? And so, sorry, I'm going to go back for a second. So when dolls play, girls play. So this means there's hardware for playing on that girls have access to, right? Like, keep that in mind. That's really key. So multiple researchers, and that includes Brenda Laurel, who was researching this in the 1990s, Carolyn Cunningham, who wrote a book in the past couple of years, have found that, in fact, one of the major barriers for girls playing games is actually just access to hardware. So often game consoles are purchased as family items, and girls end up not playing them because there will be like conflict in the family about who can access it, and girls, rather than fight over it, will just be like, okay, fine, I'll do something else. And so this means if you have like a family where there are children of multiple genders, the girl children will end up not playing on the video game console, even though it's for the family, right? And so that access to hardware being a barrier, these systems, these playable kind of like toy arcade cabinets, actually are hardware that's specifically for girls, right? Something Brenda Laurel found in her research that I always come back to and find really interesting is that she found that, like, if boys were going to play with something for a computer or video game, it meant girls in the household would not play, like they just wouldn't get to. But if something was explicitly for girls, the boys would not go near it, right? And so they often actually tried to make their games very visibly for girls because they wanted girls to be able to have that be their own. And shown in the picture here, just to mention, this is like a gaming set you can buy for your contemporary character American Girl doll, and it's an Xbox branded set. I have this, again, it's hilarious. The chair that she's sitting in is a gaming chair. It's also a speaker, so I can like plug my phone into it and listen to music. The little controller is super cute, and it's made so the doll can actually hold it and handle it. And then the little Xbox console, you can put these little discs in and it projects the games. And so there's like a dancing game and a pet game. And you can faintly see here near the text, one of those projections. That's if you project the dancing game, this is what it looks like. It's very cute. So anyway, so this hardware thing that's happening here is actually really important. So even though it's like, oh, it's so weird that this doll has an arcade cabinet, and it's really weird that it's Pac-Man, it's actually super interesting to imagine that as a way that you have something that like, oh, it's for a doll, right? So that belongs to the doll. So then it belongs to the person who the doll belongs to, which often is going to be a girl, right? Like, again, like, I'm very pro everyone playing with dolls. I think dolls are fantastic, but culturally we often still assume that dolls are for girls. So I want to end on this kind of sad note, because I always do that. I'm like a huge bummer at parties. And this is a headline from a while ago, and it's just really stuck with me, right? And it's America's daughters grow up to be women it can't handle. Defiant young girls have become a political symbol in a country that fears grown women. And it was a headline talking about, in particular, the statue of a girl that was put up on Wall Street in front of the Charging Bull. And I think about this a lot, because I do think often we're setting girls up to go into environments in which they aren't valued, in which they aren't treated equitably, in which they don't have the kind of access they've been promised. And so I really think a challenge for all of us is to make the world better, right? I don't want to come back and, like, I've been doing, you know, I do lots of public outreach. I've done game design workshops for like middle school and high school girls. And then, you know, I go into my classroom, and like often there's like 2 girls in the entire class, right? Or you know, I still have to deal with students that tell me girls don't play video games, which is actually untrue, right? Statistically untrue. And it's something that we need to realize. In fact, the people that spend the most money on video games are adult women. So if they were going to make decisions based on consumer interest, all the games should be for adult women, right? Like, that's where the money is. And so I kind of always say this, like, empowering girls, why bother? But I think that's a real question, right? I think it's a real question to say, we can't just tell girls a great story and then crash them into a reality in which they're not valued or they're not taken seriously, right? Like, we all need to work to make sure that, like, yeah, it's nice to like retcon history and imagine that girls were like totally dominating on Pac-Man at the arcade, and they might have been, right? Like, that's something that could have happened. But it's probably more important to make sure that when those girls that grow up playing with Courtney and playing Pac-Man and playing Julie's pinball machine get into high school and get out of high school and want to go on and work in the games industry or pursue computer science degrees, that they're really, really going into an industry where they're treated decently and they're valued, right? So I'm going to stop there on that drag. And then so let me stop sharing, and then I will answer questions. Okay. So scrolling back, American Girl had an American Boy line for a while, or maybe still do. Are their worlds as robust? So it didn't last, so I'm going to lean towards no, because a lot of these they've kept adding on to for like years. They do retire historical characters regularly, and they do still make boys. So if you want to go buy a doll, you can actually buy a doll that's gendered as a boy. And some of the historical dolls have like a friend, and sometimes their friend character is a boy. So actually, one of Courtney's friends in the book that's talked about quite a lot is a boy, and I think in at least one of the promotional images, one of the dolls is supposed to be him. They do have the whole doll line where you get to make a lot of design decisions about what the doll looks like, and that's, I believe, where currently most of the boy dolls are. So they're not characters, and they don't have that kind of robust world, which I think is too bad, right? I think more people should play with dolls. I think dolls teach all kinds of great things about storytelling and kind of like experimentation with the world. And I don't know, I love dolls. I think they're great. So I don't think that there's something comparable right now, though, where they have like their own historical story, right? When we were younger, American Girl dolls, particularly in their books, often took stands on social issues. Do you think that's still reflected, particularly since Pleasant Company became part of Mattel? Yes, actually. And actually, as a fun aside, another thing Mattel has been doing that I find absolutely interesting is they've made some radical changes to the Barbie line in the past few years. If you go back and look at Barbie, there's now multiple body types for Barbie, and there's still like, you know, I mean, I'm not saying these are like unproblematic, right? But it's clear that there's like a lot of effort going into kind of shifting what those brands mean and what people do with them. In the Courtney book, her mother is running for mayor, and there's a lot of it's really interesting to think about how they deal with this, because her mother's dealing with like basically a bunch of gross sexism, right? Because she's running for mayor in the 1980s, and Courtney's like having to think through what this means. And a lot of it really is about kind of like her having to watch her mother deal with sexism. And there's this moment in the book where she sticks up for her mom, right? Like she's like, of course my mom's a good mom. I think she's a good mom because she's ambitious, because she works hard, because she cares about her community, right? And so it's this real debate about like what it means to be a parent, for a woman to be a parent specifically. And so that's something that comes up. I think yeah, I think they're often dealing with political things. With this doll, they also were doing some fundraising for um, Black Girls Code at one point, and also other girls coding programs. So I think, you know, I think within the reins of like corporate entities are complicated to think about in terms of their political alignments. I do think there's a lot of people that work at Mattel that have really interesting ideas about play. I think the company does some interesting stuff. There's actually like a 40-minute, it's long, movie of the book, and it was actually made by an animation studio that does stop motion, and it's all doll based stop motion, which is super cool. And that's actually something that started out as a community practice. Like there's a lot of American Girl doll stop motion that's made by mostly teen girls, now is increasingly young women, right, who have grown up doing this, and they're really wonderful and weird. I definitely recommend watching them, and they're very sweet, right? It'll be like the dolls are going to prom, and so that watching that stop motion then becomes something that Mattel's like giving money and producing at a pretty professional level was kind of cool. They do have a house historian, usually always one, sometimes more. They were just advertising that job again, but these are usually people with like PhDs in history. Like these are like serious, real deal historians, and so a lot of that is archival research, like those kinds of artifacts. And when they make decisions that aren't historically accurate, I think those are interesting, right? And I'm a historian, but I never would be like, that's not correct, right? Like those are interesting decisions that get made for particular reasons. So like the fact that she's playing Pac-Man is like a little weird, but that's interesting, right? And so that's always kind of what I want to know what's interesting, not what's wrong.
Thank you, Carly. This was so incredibly interesting. I am the American Girl generation. I have 3 still in a box somewhere for my future children. But I had a question actually, that I wanted to ask. So I know for me personally, a lot of what I learned about history and kind of pre-internet time came from American Girl dolls. So, you know, you've learned about the American Revolution from Felicity, child labor from Samantha, and, you know, World War II from Molly. And do you think that it still has sort of that educational place now that, you know, modern girls can go into Wikipedia and get that same
I
answer?
think it absolutely does, because I think history is often uninteresting outside of a narrative. You know, and I run into this with my students all the time. I teach a class on history of video games, and it's a large class. It's my most popular class. I teach it regularly. I love it. And students are like, oh, I didn't realize history was like this. I thought you just like memorized dates. And in fact, as you've probably witnessed, if you've ever seen me talk, I'm actually really bad at dates, right? Like if I don't have the date written down, I don't remember. I'll be like, I don't know, late 80s. Because that's not what's interesting about history. What's interesting in history is like how those changes occur and what they mean for everyday people, and kind of like why things are happening. Because often historical events are extremely complicated in terms of who's involved. And I think part of what's nice about the American Girl books, those narrative books, is they really put those events in a historical context that makes sense to the reader, right? So like if you hear about the Challenger disaster, that's very, very abstract, right? But if you think about hundreds of thousands of children watching that, as they've all been looking forward to it for weeks, and you think about like they've been reading about the people on the shuttle, and they've been reading about all the preparation that all the astronauts have made and all these things, like there's like a real immediacy to that that's very different than I think like a flat event. I think history is profoundly important, of course, right? Like, I'm a historian, but I also think we have like a real obligation to talk about difficult historical topics with children. And I'm not saying that this series does that perfectly, but I do think it can be a really good springboard for having some of those conversations. I think all the time the game designer Brenda Romero, who is really well known for a game called Train, and it's a tabletop game that is only ever installed in museums. Like, you can't buy it, you can only go play it if it's on display at a museum. And it's actually a game about the Holocaust. And that series, it's called The Mechanic is the Message. That series of games came out of an incident with her daughter, who was like a grade schooler at the time, and her daughter's like learning about slavery. And Brenda Romero was horrified because her daughter was like very glibly talking about the Middle Passage and slavery, because it's like, yeah, and then they got on a boat and they went to America, and she's like, it's not like a cruise, right? Like, this is actually horrible. And so she designed this game kind of on the fly called The New World, where they draw out who all is on all these people, individual humans who are on the boat, and her daughter's having to dice roll for who survives, but they have to tell a story about each person who doesn't survive. And so they're not just numbers, they're people, right? And there's a real horror to that realization. And so, she tells the story of like sitting there with her daughter, and they're both sobbing because they're having to confront how ugly and horrible and horrific that was. And I think, I think, again, I think we have a real obligation to talk to children about difficult things. I think we have a real obligation to make sure that we're not looking away from things just because they're uncomfortable or they're sad or they're traumatic. I actually took my own daughter, who's 3.5. We went to the Henry Ford Museum recently, and one of the artifacts they have there that's really powerful is they actually have the bus that Rosa Parks was on when she began her protest that triggered the boycott of the bus system. And in that installation, they actually have, I believe it's a reproduction, but they have a Ku Klux Klan robe. And my daughter saw it and she goes, "Look, mommy, a ghost." And I'm like, it's not a ghost. It's a costume that people would wear to go do horrible things because they didn't want people to know who they were, because they were ashamed of what they were doing, or they should have been ashamed. And they went and attacked people for being different from them or believing different from them. And so it's not a ghost, it's a monster. Right. And my daughter goes, "Oh, okay," and just like continues because she's 3. But I think we all get these moments where like I could say like, yeah, it's a ghost, or like, yeah, it's scary, and blow it off, but I don't want to blow it off, right? And I don't think she'll remember that. But I'll remember that, and I'll remember that like anytime those things come up, I need to talk to her about it seriously. And I think these dolls, they often don't have the ugly conversation, but they might start the ugly conversation. We owe children and we owe students ugly conversations.
Well, thank you. This has been absolutely wonderful. I think we've come to the end of the questions. So just for everyone on the call, just a reminder, Alumni University is taking a little bit of a break. We will be back in September. I believe it's Thursday, September 16th. The University Archivist, Mindy Pugh, will be presenting on the history of Bronzeville and the Jazz Age. So we hope that you can join us, and thank you again for this wonderful presentation.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I just put in the chat for anyone that wants to follow up with me, both my Twitter handle and my email address. Always feel free to contact me. If I don't get back to you, it is not personal. It probably means I didn't even see your message. So just always feel free to email me again. And I hope everyone has a great night, and thank you for coming.